It is arguably the single most pondered question in all of history. What caused World War I? Unlike World War II, this wasn't a straightforward case of the world rallying to resist a single tyrant, or one belligerent nation pushing everyone else to take a military stand. There just wasn't that clean moral vindication. Instead, it was an incredibly messy, complex web of triggers.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to make sense of that mess. We're going to look at how a delicate but ultimately toxic balance of structural forces created a massive pile of dry tinder right across Europe. It was this huge stockpile of tension that slowly built up over decades, just waiting for a single spark to ignite it.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The most pondered question. 2. Militarism, a paranoid culture. 3. Alliances, the tangled web. 4. Imperialism, global bargaining chips. 5. Nationalism, rising internal tensions. And 6. The spark, Sarajevo and aftermath.
Okay, Section 1, the most pondered question. To make sense of it all, historians often use a really handy framework. It's the MAIN acronym: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, while boiling down such a vast conflict into a four-letter word might seem a bit simplistic, it actually acts as a remarkably useful structural backbone for our explainer today. You can think of these four concepts as four distinct layers of gunpowder packed tightly into the European powder keg.
Let's move to Section 2, militarism, a paranoid culture.
Starting with the M, the late 19th century was a period of intense military competition. Nations were judging their own strength strictly in relation to their neighbors, which bred severe paranoia. Take the famous naval race between Germany and Britain over those revolutionary dreadnought battleships. Germany desperately wanted to expand its navy, while Britain had this powerful obsession with maintaining naval dominance. But here is the truly fascinating part based on our sources: it was never really a genuine contest. The British always maintained naval superiority, yet government rhetoric on both sides greatly exaggerated this military expansionism, whipping both the public and policymakers into an absolute fearful frenzy.
Furthermore, this militarism was fueled by a really dangerous cultural naivety. Across Europe, there was a deeply ingrained, almost romantic belief that war was simply good for nations. The terrifying reality? Because they couldn't possibly grasp the potential scale and catastrophic bloodshed of a mechanized modern European war, governments fundamentally lacked the necessary fear to keep their own aggression in check. They were literally playing with fire and didn't even realize how hot it could burn.
Section 3, alliances, the tangled web.
Transitioning to the A, between 1870 and 1914, Europe effectively split down the middle into two rigid opposing camps, bound by a massive web of alliances. You had the Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, binding Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other side, the Triple Entente, formed in 1907, linking France, Britain, and Russia. Now, these weren't just friendly handshakes. These were strict, ironclad commitments to maintain each other's sovereignty or intervene militarily. Basically, if one went to war, they all went to war.
But why did this crazy system form in the first place? Well, it traces back to Germany under Otto von Bismarck. After the war in 1870, Bismarck set a precedent of playing his neighbors' imperial endeavors off one another, mostly just to maintain a balance of power. This created deep-seated suspicions everywhere. For example, France harbored intense resentment over their 1870 defeat by Germany, while Austria-Hungary and Russia had entirely incompatible interests in the Balkans. It was a highly fragile balancing act built entirely on mistrust.
Section 4. Imperialism, global bargaining chips.
Moving right along to the I, in this era, overseas colonies were largely treated as expendable units of exchange. They were global bargaining chips that could be traded without affecting the homeland. But this imperial competition had some major side effects. Distant conflicts unexpectedly forged European alliances. Take the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 over aspirations in China. The geopolitical fallout from that actually helped push the Triple Entente into existence. Meanwhile, British and French empires were rapidly expanding, driven by industrialism and the need for new markets. This caused significant resentment in Germany, prompting them to pursue a short, eventually aborted, imperial policy. It's really vital to note here that despite later rumors, pre-war strategy doesn't actually support the idea that Germany was trying to build a European empire in 1914. Rather, it was this constant global maneuvering that kept pushing these nations into closer, more volatile proximity.
Section 5. Nationalism, rising internal tensions.
Arriving at N, we see a brand new source of tension:
The Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire was incredibly fragile. It was basically a tottering structure made up of 11 completely different nationalities. Specifically, there were large Slavic populations in Galicia and the Balkans, whose fierce nationalist aspirations ran completely counter to the empire's cohesion. Put simply, they wanted their own nations, not to be ruled by a distant emperor. This nationalism created fresh areas of interest for nations to compete over, and in the Balkans, this rising tide of nationalism directly piqued Russia's historic interests, putting them on an absolute collision course with Austria-Hungary.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, The Spark, Sarajevo and Aftermath.
When you look back, you can clearly trace this rapid, domino-like escalation over the decades. From Bismarck's balance of power in 1870 to those rigid alliance structures locking into place in 1882 and 1907, all of this architectural tension leads us directly into 1914 and the fateful July crisis, a single month of just disastrous diplomatic and governmental miscalculations.
The exact trigger, the spark that finally hit that dry tinder, occurred when Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Bosnian-Serbian nationalist organization known as the Black Hand Gang, assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife in Sarajevo. Because this specific act of Serbian nationalism was interpreted as official Serbian policy by Austria-Hungary, it initiated a catastrophic domino effect of war declarations, violently pulling in that entire tangled web of alliances we just discussed.
Now, when it comes to who is actually to blame for the war, the historical dialogue is vast, fractured, and distorted by a lot of biases. As your host, I want to be perfectly clear. We aren't taking any sides here. We are simply mapping out the historical debate based on our sources. In the aftermath of the conflict, the War Guilt Clause aggressively overplayed Germany's supposed eager expansionism, contrasting it unfairly with a sanitized view of British imperialism. In reality, blame has been directed at almost every single combatant. Some blame the German Schlieffen Plan for bringing Britain into the war. Others point to the massive scale of Russian mobilization or inherent imperial and capitalist rivalries. And historian A.J.P. Taylor's fascinating timetable theory points to delicate, highly complex military mobilization plans that practically forced nations into aggressive preparations just to avoid being left behind. Every single one of these points has historical merit.
But ultimately, what proved most devastating was the combination of that rigid alliance network paired with the widespread, wildly misguided belief that the best way to fight a modern war was to attack, and that war itself was beneficial. That is the tragic thematic conclusion of this explainer. The idea of a glorious war was incredibly strong before 1914, but the sheer scale of the mechanized slaughter that followed completely destroyed that myth. By the end of the war, the concept of a glorious war was completely dead.
Which leaves us with a vital question to ponder today. We've seen how the MAIN framework, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, acted as structural dry tinder a century ago. So how might these exact same structural forces exist as dry tinder in our modern geopolitical landscape? Are we building new webs of alliances? Are we seeing a resurgence in unchecked nationalism? It's definitely something to think about next time you read the news. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.